When the letters from my sister Emily started arriving, I thought she was finally happy. She'd always been restless, searching for something that I never quite understood. First, it was meditation retreats, then yoga, then a vegan commune. Every time I called her, she was off chasing some new purpose. But the haven of light, this one seemed different. At first, her letters were filled with joy, excitement, and a sense of peace. She talked about how she had finally found the way, and that Peter Granger, the man leading the community, had shown her the truth. The things she wrote were unsettling, but I brushed them off, convinced she'd eventually leave this phase, like all the others.
But then the letters stopped. I went from getting weekly updates to nothing. No phone calls, no postcards, just silence. 2 months passed, and I started to worry. Emily wasn't the type to disappear without a word. I reached out to everyone I could, old friends, family, even some of her fellow commune hoppers, but no one had heard from her. That's when I started digging deeper. The haven of light wasn't easy to find. The community didn't have an online presence, no Facebook groups, no Instagram account. Even Google Maps failed to show where it was. The only clue I had was a postmark from somewhere deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I needed to know more. I met Lena through an online forum, a place where ex-cult members shared their experiences. Her username was familiar, and after exchanging messages for a few days, I learned that she had been part of the Haven of Light for nearly a year before she escaped. She agreed to meet me in person, and that's when I realized how serious this really was. When Lena walked into the cafe where we'd agreed to meet, I barely recognized her. She was gaunt, her eyes sunken, and her movements slow, almost robotic. She seemed afraid to even speak, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if someone was watching her. Over coffee, she told me everything she could remember about the Haven. "It's not what it seems," Lena began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Peter Granger, he's not just a leader. He's something else. He controls everything, everyone." She described the compound as a small, isolated community hidden deep in the mountains. The members lived in cabins, completely cut off from the outside world. No phones, no internet, no contact with anyone except Peter and the other followers. Peter claimed to be a prophet, a guide chosen by God to lead his people to salvation. And the people believed him. They worshipped him, hung on his every word. But beneath the surface, Lena said, there was something much darker. "He started talking about the final day," Lena continued, her hands trembling as she spoke. "He said we were all going to ascend to a higher plane, that we'd leave our earthly bodies behind. But it wasn't just talk. He was preparing us. There were drills, stockpiles of supplies, and cyanide." My stomach churned at the mention of cyanide. The word echoed in my mind, bringing back the horrific memories of the Jonestown Massacre, the mass suicide led by Jim Jones in 1978. Over 900 people had died, many of them forced to drink poison under the orders of their deranged leader. Was Peter Granger planning something similar? Lena told me she had escaped just days before Peter planned to ascend. She had overheard him talking to his inner circle, instructing them on how to mix the cyanide with a fruit punch. The plan was for the entire community to drink it together, believing they would ascend to paradise. "I couldn't do it," Lena said, tears welling in her eyes. "I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't convince anyone else. They were too far gone. They believed him. I knew I had to get Emily out of there. I couldn't wait for the authorities to step in. There wasn't enough time. So I packed my bags and headed to the mountains. The drive to the Haven was long and grueling. The winding roads seemed to stretch on forever. with nothing but dense trees and fog-covered hills in every direction. There were no signs, no markers to indicate I was on the right path, but I followed the vague directions Lena had given me, and after what felt like hours, I saw it. The entrance to the haven. It wasn't much, just a dirt road leading up to a small gated compound. I parked my car a mile away and continued on foot, my heart pounding in my chest. The gate wasn't guarded, but as I slipped through the trees, I could see the compound beyond it. Small cabins arranged in a circle with a larger building at the center. There were people moving about, dressed in simple clothes, going about their day as if nothing was wrong. I scanned the crowd for Emily, hoping to see her face among them, but there was no sign of her. I decided to sneak closer, hoping to find her cabin. The air was thick with tension, and every rustle of leaves or creak of a branch made me freeze in place. The compound had an eerie stillness to it, like the calm before a storm. As I approached the main building, I heard voices. Peter Granger's voice was unmistakable, calm, charismatic, but with an undercurrent of menace. He was addressing a group of followers, speaking about the final day and their imminent ascension. "We are the chosen ones," Peter said, his voice ringing out across the compound. "Soon we will leave this world behind and enter the kingdom of light. But first, we must shed our earthly forms. We must make the ultimate sacrifice." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was preparing them for mass suicide. I needed to find Emily now. I ducked behind one of the cabins, keeping to the shadows as I searched for any sign of her. That's when I saw her. She was standing near the edge of the compound, talking to one of the other followers. She looked thinner than I remembered, her face pale and gaunt, but it was her. My heart leapt in my chest, and I called out to her in a hushed voice, "Emily!" She turned, her eyes widening in surprise as she saw me. For a moment, I thought she would run to me, that she would recognize the danger and leave with me. But then her expression changed. It was as if a curtain had fallen over her face, and she stared at me with a cold, distant gaze. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "You don't understand. Peter is leading us to salvation. We're finally going to be free." "Emily, this is a cult," I hissed, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "He's going to kill you. You need to come with me now." But she shook her head, her eyes glassy and unfocused. "No, you don't get it. We're going to ascend. We're going to be with God." Desperation clawed at my chest. I couldn't lose her, not like this. I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward me. "Emily, please. This is madness. He's going to make you drink poison. You'll die." She wrenched her arm away from me, her expression hardening. "Peter says we're not really dying. We're just shedding our bodies. We'll be free." I tried to reason with her, but it was no use. Peter had her completely under his control. I was about to beg her one last time when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see two of Peter's inner circle approaching, their face blank and emotionless. "You shouldn't be here," one of them said. "Peter will want to speak with you." Before I could react, they grabbed me, dragging me toward the main building. I struggled, but they were too strong. They forced me inside, where Peter was waiting. Peter Granger was taller than I had expected, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through me. He smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was cold, calculated. "You must be Emily's sister," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "It's not often we get visitors. I'm afraid you've come at a rather inconvenient time." I didn't say anything. I just stared at him, my heart racing. "You see," Peter continued, We're about to begin our ascension. Emily is very excited about it. She's finally found her place in the world, and I'd hate for you to interfere with that." My blood ran cold. He was going to kill them, kill all of them. "You're insane," I spat, my voice shaking with anger. "You're leading them to their deaths." Peter's smile widened. "Death is just a doorway, my dear. We're all going to walk through it together." I knew I had to get out of there, but the two men holding me weren't going to let me go easily. I needed to stall, to buy myself some time. "You don't have to do this," I said, my voice trembling. "You don't have to die." Peter tilted his head, as if considering my words. "Perhaps not, but the choice has already been made." Before I could respond, I heard the sound of shouting from outside. The police. Someone must have called them. Chaos erupted in the compound as the followers scattered, some of them running toward the woods, others collapsing. Suddenly, the sound of police sirens shattered the tension, their sharp wails piercing the heavy atmosphere. It seemed someone, perhaps one of the frightened members who had finally come to their senses, had alerted the authorities. The compound erupted in chaos, with followers scattering in every direction. Some sprinted toward the woods, while others fell to the ground, their faith in ascension shattered by the realization that salvation wasn't coming, only death. Peter's face darkened. The serene, godlike figure he had been moments ago was replaced with cold, calculating fury. I knew then that his followers weren't his family. They were his tools, expendable, replaceable, like pawns in a grand, twisted game. He glanced at me with contempt, his icy blue eyes narrowing. "You ruined it," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. They were ready. I stood frozen, my heart thundering in my chest. In that moment, I saw him for what he really was, not a prophet or a savior, but a cowardly, deranged man willing to throw away hundreds of lives to satisfy his delusions. One of the officers burst into the room, his gun drawn. "Step away from her," he ordered, his voice firm and steady. Peter didn't flinch. He simply smiled, a slow, menacing smile that sent chills down my spine. "You think you've stopped me?" he asked, his voice mocking. "You can't stop the inevitable." Without another word, Peter turned and ran toward the back of the building, disappearing into the shadows. The officers pursued him, but by the time they reached the woods, he was gone, vanished into the dense forest that surrounded the compound. I was pulled outside by one of the officers, my mind racing, my heart aching with fear for Emily. As we emerged from the main building, I saw her standing among the crowd of followers, her face pale and blank, as if the very life had been drained from her. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. She didn't even look at me. In the aftermath, dozens of people were rescued from the compound, many of them in shock, confused and dazed, unable to comprehend what had almost happened. The authorities found the cyanide stockpiles in one of the cabins, just as Lena had warned me. There were crates filled with bottles of poison, hidden beneath sacks of food supplies. It was enough to kill everyone in the compound several times over. If the police hadn't arrived when they did, Peter Granger would have led them all to their deaths, just like Jim Jones had done decades earlier in Jonestown. I watched as the officers led the survivors away, wrapping them in blankets and offering them water. They were in shock, most of them unable to comprehend how close they had come to dying. I scanned the crowd, desperately searching for Emily. I needed to get her out of there to save her from this nightmare. Then I saw her, standing near the edge of the compound, her face blank and her eyes distant. She didn't look like the sister I knew. Her spirit, her spark, it was all gone. Peter had taken it from her. I ran to her, tears streaming down my face. "Emily," I called, my voice shaking. "Emily, it's me. It's your sister." She didn't respond. She didn't even look at me. I reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling her toward me. "Please, Emily, it's over. He's gone. You're safe now." For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes, a brief flash of recognition, but it was gone just as quickly. She pulled away from me, her movements slow and mechanical. "I'm not leaving," she whispered, her voice hollow. "This is where I belong." My heart shattered. The Emily I knew was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a person, brainwashed by Peter's lies. I tried to reason with her, to beg her to come home with me, but it was no use. She was too far gone. The police allowed me to stay with her for a while, but as the night wore on, it became clear that Emily wasn't going to leave. She refused to go with me, and the officers couldn't force her. In the end, all I could do was watch as she was taken to a nearby hospital for evaluation, along with the other survivors. I stayed in the town for weeks, hoping that Emily would come to her senses, that she would realize what had happened and return to me. But she never did. She stayed in the hospital for a few days before being transferred to a rehabilitation center where they tried to deprogram her. I visited her every day, but each time, it was like talking to a stranger. Peter Granger was never found. Despite an extensive search of the surrounding woods, he vanished without a trace. Some say he fled to another country. Others believe he's hiding in the mountains, waiting to rebuild his cult. But I know the truth. He's still out there, somewhere, planning his next move. The Haven of Light was dismantled, the cabins torn down, the land reclaimed by the forest. But the memory of what happened there will haunt me for the rest of my life. I lost my sister to that place, and no matter how hard I try, I can't bring her back.